Warning: this is a true crime channel and is not for the faint of heart or the easily impressionable. This video may contain details that some viewers may find highly disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned.
Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel where I still don't have any of the proper equipment or refuse to follow the script, and where I enjoy talking about all that is murder, mayhem, and the macabre just way too fucking much for it to be considered healthy. Now, I know my horde that I promised you another double feature. However, I did get it done and I re-listened to it and I fucking hated it. I hated it because this particular killer that I want to talk about deserves his own video. You see, my horde, the killer of this hour is one that holds and resides in a very special and tender place in my cold, black, and withered heart, as he was the first killer I learned about when I first began my rather gruesome hobby of diving into the minds of serial killers, and a girl truly never does forget her first encounter with the macabre. Though the scenes I'm about to reveal to you may be incredibly gruesome, I can't help but feel almost sorry for the poor guy, as I truly do believe that nature did not overcome the nurture, or therefore lack of this particular killer. So, without further ado, you know the drill by now, my horde. Pick your poison, sit back, relax, and let's have ourselves a little conversation. Our killer of the hour is none other than the infamous Ed Gein, the real-life version of the fictional characters Buffalo Bill from the Silence of the Lamb books and movie series, my personal favorites, as well as the inspiration for Norman Bates in the classic movie and book Psycho. Not only that, he is also the inspiration to Leatherface of the Texas Chainsaw Massacres and countless more. His name is synonymous with the macabre and all things that are horrible and murderous. In fact, I would even compare him to a particular clan in one of my personal favorite role-playing games called VTM, or Vampires the Masquerade, and I would compare him to that of the Zemisi clan of the Sabbat sect, for those of you who are fans of that particular game, which I would guess not many of you are. However, I do believe that those who are will get that reference. He was quite a flesh crafter after all. Now, Ed Gein, I do believe, was the overall product not of his own nature, but more so nurture. And truly, I do believe his abusive and tyrannical mother played a key role in the horror scene that Ed would later reveal to the world. Ed Gein is an American killer, not a serial killer, just a murderer, as though he does not have the particular psychology that a serial killer would have. In fact, he is possibly one of the tamest killers I have ever come across. He was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin on August 27th in 1906. He was the second of two boys of his father George Gein and his mother Augusta Gein. Now, Ed had an older brother named Henry, and Augusta, who despised her husband, who was an alcoholic and was unable to keep a job, as he had worked various times as a carpenter, a tanner, and even an insurance salesman. George even once owned a local grocery shop for a few years, but then sold the business, and the family left the city to live in the isolation of a 155-acre farm in the town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, which then became the Gein family's permanent residence. Now, Augusta took advantage of this isolation by turning away outsiders who could have possibly influenced either of her sons. Now, Augusta was also a fervently religious and mostly Lutheran woman, and in fact, Edward only left the farm to attend school. Outside of that, he spent most of his time doing chores on the farm. Now, his mother preached to her boys about the innate immorality of the world and the evil of drinking, which on the surface sounds all right, until you divulge a little further into her beliefs, as she also believed that all women were naturally prostitutes and instruments of the devil, including herself. Now, she reserved time every afternoon to read them from the Bible, usually selecting very graphic verses from the Old Testament concerning death, murder, and divine retribution. Quite the bedtime or even afternoon stories for your children. Now, Edward was shy, and his classmates and teachers remember him having strange mannerisms, such as seemingly random laughter as if he was laughing at his own personal jokes. To make matters worse, his mother would punish him whenever he tried to make friends. Despite his poor social development that would last him throughout his life, he did fairly well in school, particularly in reading. Now, on April 1st of 1940, Ed's father George died of heart failure caused by his alcoholism at 66 years old. Henry and Ed began doing odd jobs around town to help cover the living expenses. Now, the brothers were generally considered reliable and honest by the residents of the community. While both worked as handyman, Ed also frequently babysat for the neighbors despite his habits. He enjoyed babysitting, it seemed, and he also seemed to relate more easily with the children than he did the adults, which does not at all surprise me, as he was under-socially developed due to his mother isolating him for so long. Now, Henry, however, was much more well-adapted and even began dating a divorced single mother of two and even planned on moving in with her. But Henry worried about his brother's attachment to their mother and often spoke ill of her around Ed, who responded to such comments with shock and hurt. Now, the interesting thing about Ed Gein is how much in common he actually does share with his fictional counterpart, Norman Bates. You see, they both exhibited symptoms and signs of a Freudian theory known as the Oedipus complex. And what the Oedipus complex is, for those who don't know, is the unconscious sexual desire that a son has for their mother. And Ed did, in fact, meet this particular complex's criteria almost to the letter. And even on May 16th of 1944, when Henry and Ed were burning away marsh vegetation on the property, the fire suddenly got out of control, drawing the attention of the local fire department. By the end of the day, the fire having been extinguished and the firefighters gone, Ed suddenly reported his brother missing. With lanterns and flashlights, a search party searched for Henry, whose dead body was found lying face down. Apparently, he had been dead for some time, and it appeared that the cause of death was heart failure, since he had not been burned or injured otherwise. It was later reported in a biography of Gein's, called Deviant, that Henry had bruises on his head, and these were never explained. The police dismissed the possibility of foul play, and the county coroner later officially listed asphyxiation as the cause of death. The authorities accepted this accident theory, but no official investigation was conducted, and nor was an autopsy performed. Some suspected that Ed Gein had killed his brother for daring to insult and speak ill of their beloved mother. Now, questioning Gein about the death of Bernice Worden in 1957, a state investigator brought up questions about Henry's death. Now, another man, George Ardwut, who studied the case, wrote that in retrospect, it is possible and likely that Henry's death was the Cain and Abel aspect of the case. Now, this time, Ed Gein and his mother were now alone, together. And Augusta, unfortunately, had a paralyzing stroke shortly after Henry's death, and Gein, as the most beloved son and devoted son, dedicated himself to taking care of her. Sometime in 1945, Gein would later recount that he and his mother visited a man named Smith who lived nearby to purchase straw. According to Gein, Augusta witnessed Smith beat a dog to death. A woman inside the Smith home came outside to yell at him to stop. Augusta was extremely upset by this scene, but what bothered her did not appear to be the brutality shown towards the dog, but the presence of the woman in general. Augusta told Ed later that the woman was not married to Smith, so had no business being there. Smith's harlot, Augusta angrily called her. She actually had a second stroke soon after, and her health deteriorated rapidly. Her death happened on December 29th in 1945, at the age of 67. Ed was devastated by her death. In the words of an author who wrote one of his biographies, he had lost his only friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world, except for maybe his insanity. Now, Gein held on to the farm and earned money from different odd jobs. He boarded up rooms used by his mother, including the upstairs, downstairs parlor, and living room, leaving them completely untouched. While the rest of the house became increasingly squalid, these rooms remained pristine. Gein lived thereafter in a small room next to the kitchen. Around this time, he began showing interest in reading death cult magazines and adventure stories, particularly those involving cannibals or Nazi atrocities. Gein was a handyman and received farm subsidy from the federal government starting in about 1951. He occasionally worked for the local municipal road crew and crop threshing crews in the area as well. Sometime between 1946 and 1956, he also sold an 80-acre parcel of land that his brother Henry had once owned. On the morning of November 16th in 1957, Plainfield hardware store owner Bernice Worden disappeared. A Plainfield resident reported that the hardware store's truck had been driven out from the rear of the building at around 9:30 a.m. The hardware store was closed for the entire day, and some residents believe this was because of deer hunting season. Bernice Worden's son, the deputy sheriff Frank Worden, entered the store at around 5 p.m. to find the store's cash register open and bloodstains on the floor. Frank Worden told investigators that Ed Gein had been in the store the evening before his mother's disappearance, and that he had stated he would return the next morning for a gallon of antifreeze. A sales slip for a gallon of antifreeze was the last receipt written by Worden on the morning she disappeared. On the evening that same day, Gein was arrested at West Plainfield grocery store, and his entire farm was searched. The sheriff's deputy discovered Warren's decapitated body in a shed on Gein's property, hung upside down by her legs with a crossbar at her ankles and ropes at her wrist. Her torso was dressed out like a deer by his own description, which basically means gutted, and left to hang and drain. It's not a pretty sight. She had actually been shot by a .22 caliber rifle, and the mutilations were made after her death. Now, I warn you, my murderous horde, as I normally do when things are about to get rather graphic. And to be fair, those who are a fan of VTM will now see why I called Ed Gein quite the flesh crafter of his time. The following is a list of things that were found in Ed Gein's house on the night he was arrested. Whole human bones and fragments, a waste paper basket made of human skin covering several chair seats. In fact, they had been completely reupholstered using human skin. Skulls on his bedpost, female skulls with some of the tops sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso, skinned from the shoulders to the waist. In fact, it was a mammary corset, meaning the breasts were still whole and attached to the corset. Leggings made from human leg skin, mask made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag. Mary Hogan's skull was in a box as well. Bernice Warden's entire head was in a burlap sack, and her heart was in a plastic bag in front of Gein's pot-bellied stove. Now, this is where it gets a bit more graphic, as in fact 9 vulvas of obviously women were found in a shoebox. A young girl's dress and the vulvas of 2 females that were judged to have been around 15 years old were also found. A belt was made from female human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a lamp or window shade drawstring, a lampshade made of the skin of a human face. Fingernails from female fingers were also found. Now, these autographs were photographed at the state crime laboratory and then promptly destroyed. Damn it. When questioned, Gein told investigators that between 1947 and 1952, he had made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to 3 local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies while he was in a daze-like state. On about 30 of those visits, he said he came out of the daze while in the cemetery and left the grave in good order, and returned home empty-handed. On the other occasions, however, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women he thought resembled his mother, and took the bodies home, where he tanned their skins and made his paraphernalia. Now, while Gein did choose victims that resembled his mother, the only difference is the way that they presented themselves that went completely against Augusta's views. For example, Mary Hogan was a tavern owner known to have a very nasty mouth. Gein took note of this, as well as the amount of disapproval that his mother would have had towards such rash behavior. The women Gein chose to murder openly were the ones against Augusta's views as to how proper women should act. Killing them, in his mind, satisfied his mother in some delusional way. Now, Gein admitted to stealing from the 9 graves and led investigators to their locations, because authorities were rather uncertain as to whether the slight-framed Gein was capable of single-handedly digging up a grave during a single evening, let alone taking the bodies home. They exhumed 2 of the graves and found them to be empty, one even having a crowbar in place of the body, thus apparently corroborating Gein's confession. Now, in fact, there was 3 test graves that were identified by Gein and were opened. The caskets were actually inside wooden boxes, and the top boards ran crossways, not lengthwise, across them. Now, the tops of the boxes were about 2 feet or 60 centimeters below the surface of in the sandy soil, and Gein had actually robbed the graves soon after their funerals while the graves were not completed. They were found empty, as Gein described. 1 casket was completely empty, 1 Gein had failed to open when he lost his pry bar, and most of the body was gone from the 3rd, though Gein had returned rings and some of the body parts. Soon after his mother's death, Gein began to create a woman's suit so that he could become his mother, to literally crawl into her skin. Do you see where I'm going with this, Norman Bates? Mother isn't feeling quite herself. Oh, jeez, I'm getting bad flashbacks. Now, Gein denied having sex with the bodies he exhumed, explaining, "They smelled too bad." I shouldn't laugh. Now, during the state crime laboratory interrogation, Gein also admitted to shooting the Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had been missing since 1954, and whose head had actually been found in his house, but he later denied memory of the details of her death. A 16-year-old youth whose parents were a friend of Gein's and who attended ball games and movies with him reported that Gein kept shrunken heads in his house, which Gein had described as relics from the Philippines sent to him by a cousin who had served on the islands during World War II. Now, upon investigation by the police, these were determined to be real. They were human facial skins carefully peeled from the corpses and used by Gein as masks. Now, Gein was also considered a suspect in several other unsolved cases in Wisconsin during the year 1953, including the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, a lacrosse babysitter, but he was never charged nor tried for that. Now, during questioning, a sheriff reportedly assaulted Gein by banging his head and face into a brick wall. As a result, Gein's initial confession was ruled inadmissible. On November 21st in 1957, Gein was arraigned on one count of first-degree murder in the county court, where he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found to be mentally incompetent, thus unfit for trial. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which is now the Dodge Correctional Institution, which is a maximum security facility in Wisconsin, and then he was later transferred to the Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. In 1968, doctors determined Gein was now mentally able to confer with counsel and participate in his defense. The trial began on November 7th of 1968 and lasted about a week. A psychiatrist testified that Gein had told him that he did not know whether the killing of Bernice Worden was intentional or not. Gein had told him that while examining a gun in Worden's store, the gun had gone off, killing her. Gein testified that after trying to load a bullet into the rifle, it discharged. He said he had not aimed the rifle at Worden and didn't remember anything else that happened that morning. At the request of the defense, Gein's trial was actually held without a jury, and the judge actually agreed with this. Gein was found guilty on November 14th. A second trial dealt with Gein's sanity after testimony by doctors from the prosecution and the defense. The judge ruled that Gein was not guilty by reason of insanity and ordered him to be committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Gein would spend the rest of his life there in a mental hospital. Due to prohibitive cost, Gein was tried for only one murder, the judge later wrote, that of Mrs. Worden. He also, though, admitted to killing Mary Hogan. Ed Gein actually died at Mendota Mental Institute due to respiratory failure, secondary to lung cancer, on July 26th in 1984 at the age of 77. Over the years, souvenir seekers chipped pieces from his gravestone at the Plainfield Cemetery until the stone itself was actually stolen in 2000. It was later recovered in the June next year near Seattle, and was placed in storage at the county sheriff's department then after. The grave itself is now unmarked but not unknown. Gein is buried between his parents and his brother in the cemetery there. Now, Ed Gein has gained such infamy in American pop culture that, as evidenced by its numerous appearances in film and music and many other publications, the tale first came into widespread public attention with the fictionalized version presented by Robert Bloch in his 1959 suspense novel known as Psycho. In addition, Alfred Hitchcock actually made the movie Psycho in the 1960s, which was based on this novel. Gein's story was very loosely adapted to a number of films, including Deranged, 1974, In Light of the Moon, 2000, which was released in the USA and Australia as Ed Gein, 2001, Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, 2007, Hitchcock, 2012, and the Rob Zombie films House of a Thousand Corpses, and even its sequel, The Devil's Rejects. Gein served as a model for several book and film characters, most notably such fictional serial killers as Norman Bates from Psycho, as I said, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, and most recently, the character Dr. Oliver Thredson from American Horror Story Asylum. Now, there was even a film project in the making for a full-on documentary for Ed Gein from 75 to 76, but the entire plan was actually just aborted altogether, just due to lack of evidence and lack of backing for it. At the time, news reports of Gein's crime spawned a subgenre of black humor as well. Since the 1950s, Gein has been frequently exploited in a transgressive art or shock rock that often without association with his life or crimes beyond the shock value of his name. These examples include the song titled Dead Skin Mask from 1990 from the Slayer album Seasons of the Abyss, Nothing to Gain, spelled Nothing to Gein, 2001 in Mudvayne's album LD50, and Ed Gein in 1992 from the Zingings album Rusty Never Sleeps. Ed Gein's atrocities were also satirized in the Blind Melon's Skinned off of the 1955 album Soup as well, which actually has a very cheery instrumentation and even some semi-factual representation of Gein's crimes. Arguably, though, it is more towards the comedic end. And one other thing before I go, there is actually something rather interesting that happened to the Gein family house before Ed Gein's death. You see, the property was actually scheduled to be auctioned, as many killers' houses and personal effects are once they are convicted. Now, this was supposed to happen on March 30th in 1958. Amid rumors, the house was actually to become a tourist attraction, which terrified and appalled the locals there. However, this was never to come to fruition, as on March 27th, I should say, just days before the auction, the house was destroyed by fire. Arson was suspected, but the cause was never officially determined or even truly investigated. When Gein learned of this incident while in detention, he shrugged it off and said, just as well. Now, Gein's car, however, which he did use to haul the bodies of his victims, was sold at public auction for $760 to a carnival sideshow operator by the name of Bunny Gibbons. Gibbons later charged carnival goers about 25 cents for admission to see it. And that is all the time I have for you for now, my lovelies. Remember, blessed be, and stay classy.